Greetings. Let's talk about nature spirituality. To do this, I'm going to use the word eco-spirituality as an umbrella term for all that and unpack a little bit of why that is. And so in this presentation, I want to look at some of the ranges of spiritual experiences connected with the natural world. Theodore Roszak once said that all psychologies were originally eco-psychologies, and in the same way, all spiritualities, if you go back far enough, were originally eco-spiritualities that held the sacred and the natural together. We didn't experience ourselves as separate from the natural world, and our spirituality reflected that. So I should mention that in terms of that word spiritual, the way I'm going to use it in this presentation is making a conscious connection with something transhuman that's experienced as immanent and sacred. So I'm not sticking to a supernatural definition or a religious definition, but more about sensing something bound up with and inherent in the wisdom of nature and cosmos. So that seems to be a large enough way of holding spirituality that it doesn't necessarily collide with either pagan beliefs on the one hand or monotheistic beliefs on the other. And yet it's something that we can actually experience. So we don't need a particular dogma in order to mediate between us and the experience of the sacred and the natural world. As far as types of eco-spirituality, there are as many as there are peoples, as many as there are tribes. There are spirits of place in many different cultures. There used to be in Roman culture household spirits, genius loci, the spirit of any site that you live on, abundant nature spirits. And so if you add all those together, you get an incredible profusion of nature spirits, practices, dimensions, approaches, what have you. And we could even include animals in that. There's occasionally we see pictures or video of animals that look like they're meditating or in trance states or what have you. So it could be that spirituality is part of the rest of the animal kingdom, not just exclusive to us, and maybe everything participates in it, as certain mystics like to poeticize. In any case, there's a number of influences that have marginalized eco-spirituality. Part of it is not so much monotheistic religion per se as the emphasis that was brought by powerful people on otherworldly salvation. This is usually otherworldly salvation for the masses, while the people in charge of the religion accumulate worldly possessions for themselves. So that was one factor. The hewing down of the sacred groves in Europe, for instance, that's gone on all over the world. There's the rise of industrialization and what William Blake called the dark satanic mills of factories and pollution. And then after that, the onset of a mechanistic worldview that tried to deanimate the world and divest it of any kinds of sacred presences. So scientific materialism, for instance. And with all of this, practices of earth spirituality or nature spirituality fell into decline, especially in the West. But they never entirely went away. They persisted in many different cultures as underground traditions. So when they resurfaced in contemporary times in the West, one form that this took goes by the term spiritual ecology, which is an umbrella term for ideas and practices and studies at the intersection of nature, religion, ecology, and environmentalism. Now, oddly enough, the term spiritual ecology, when it was coined in 1972 by Frank Stempel Sullivan, who wrote a book called Spiritual Ecology, it was pretty much the opposite of what we now mean by it. So he wrote about this kind of anti-ecological, quote, science that was an attempt to separate pure spirit, as he called it, from our animal mind and flesh, and which is a project of dissociation. And he wrote in a lot of capital letters about spiritual abilities and qualities and stuff like that. But today, spiritual ecology refers more to a transdisciplinary movement that opposes environmental degradation by addressing the spiritual dimension underneath our current planet-wide crisis. That's a definition by Leslie Sponsel offered in 2001. So this spirit-matter dualism and lack of care and responsibility, the narcissistic bubble that puts us in charge of everything, including the natural world, have been absolutely catastrophic for the health of all creatures and as well as entire ecosystems. So spiritual ecology brings together intellectual and spiritual and ecological activities that open up our interdependency between our outer ecological state, our level of consciousness of the sacred in creation, and our interrelationship to soul. And so some ancestors of this field include Henry David Thoreau, Aldo Leopold, Francis of Assisi, John Muir, Rachel Carson, and going farther back, earth-honoring indigenous societies and their shamans and medicine people. So Llewellyn Vaughan Lee is a Sufi mystic and a lineage-holding master. And when he presents spiritual ecology, he emphasizes that a vision of the divine only as transcendent, heavenly but not earthly, creates an inner imbalance that encourages not to take the outward world seriously. And this kind of a split goes hand in hand with patriarchy's devaluation and exploitation of matter. Matter whose sacred dimension disappears between the uses that we make of it. So we learn after a while to not appreciate it anymore. And so over the centuries of industrialization and scientific materialism, many of us have forgotten what the sense of the sacred in the world actually feels like. And Llewellyn Vaughan Lee speculates that when this happens, this actually affects Earth as well, because Earth is part of our cycle of appreciation for everything. And so the wisdom that's waiting for us in plants and animals, in landscapes, in atmosphere, weather, rain, remains inaccessible until we see how it is that we live in relation to these things and begin to cultivate an attitude of reverence and learn to listen to them once again. And I like to think that parapsychological theory and practice contribute to that by showing us how deeply implicated we are in the presences of the places where we live, the objects that are around us, the elements, climate, and all the rest of it. And eco-psychology to some extent does that as well, and ecotherapy too, by showing us how dependent our health is on the health of ecosystems that we participate in. So spiritual ecology's scholarship appears in the work of Llewellyn Vaughan Lee, Leslie Sponsel, Sarah McFarlane Taylor, Mitchell Tomashow, Stephen Rockefeller, David Loy, and he calls it healing ecology. Roger Gottlieb, Bron Tyler to some extent, Mary Ellen Tucker, and John Grimm. And there's a journal that's called Worldviews, Environment, Culture, and Religion that has focused on different parts of spiritual ecology since 1997. And then there's another periodical you should be aware of, Journal for the Study of Religion, Nature, and Culture, which started up in 2007. And books that you can read if you want to look into this include Earthlight, which is a collection of journal articles, but it's in the form of an anthology, Earthlight, Spiritual Wisdom for an Ecological Age. That was published in 2006. And then Bron Taylor's book, Dark Green Religion, came out in 2009. There's a book by Leslie Sponsel, published in 2012, called Spiritual Ecology, A Quiet Revolution. And then Spiritual Ecology, The Cry of the Earth was published by Llewellyn Bohnlee and Sandra Ingerman in 2016. And it has some writing in it by Joanna Macy and a number of other people, including Thich Nhat Hanh. In 2018, the Parliament of World Religions had a panel that was called Spiritual Ecology and Sacred Rebellion as part of a workshop, a larger workshop. And the idea was to mobilize the world's population who identify as religious to continue this alignment between spiritual ecology and another field that was born into academia. And this field is called, it's been called two things. One is religion and ecology, and the second one is ecology and religion. Depends on which publication you look at. But in any case, that field, which is allied with and aligned with spiritual ecology, there's not a sharp separation. It began as 10 conferences on religion and ecology that were organized by Evelyn Tucker and John Grimm and held at the Center for the Study of World Religions at Harvard back in from 1996 to 1998. And the religions that were most featured were the world religions of Buddhism, Christianity, Confucianism, Hinduism, indigenous traditions as a category, Islam, Jainism, Judaism, and Shinto. And each conference published its own anthology. And this got the attention of the United Nations also. And so there was a 2-volume encyclopedia of religion and nature that was edited by Bron Taylor and also Jeff Kaplan, and that debuted in 2005. So this new field, a good description of it appears. It was written by Roger Gottlieb in 2006, and I'm going to read you a little bit of it. It's the abstract for it, and this appears in the Oxford Handbook of Religion and Ecology. So this will give you a sense of what religion and ecology, also called ecology and religion, is all about. So in the last 2 decades, the connections between religion and ecology have been made manifest by explosive growth in theological writings, scholarship, institutional commitment, and public action. Theologians from every religious tradition have confronted religion's attitudes toward nature and complicity in the environmental crisis. This confrontation has given rise to vital new theologies based on the recovery of marginalized elements of tradition, profound criticisms of the past, and new visions of God, the earth, the sacred, and human beings. Religious morality has expanded to include our relations to other species and ecosystems, and religious practices come to include rituals that help us express our grief, Joanna Macy's work among them, and remorse, and to celebrate what is left. Further, dialogues on how traditional religions viewed nature and how these views should be reinterpreted or altered in the light of the environmental crisis now join criticisms of economics, technology, energy policies, science, transportation, agriculture, taxation, and education. So, at this moment in time, every major religion in the world has publicly announced some kind of a statement, a public statement, that supports care for the earth. Those statements are online for all the religions. And so this is a good thing. However, it illustrates the ability of religion to adapt to the times to some extent. But there's something that it leaves to one side, which is the direction I want to head next, which is, what about those of us who desire and practice an earth-honoring spirituality, but don't belong to a world religion? What is there for us to do? So there is spiritual ecology, but a lot of its focus is on alignment with traditional religion, not so much on heathenism, paganism, goddess spirituality, aboriginal animism, or walking one's own spiritual path in relation to the natural world. Also, spiritual ecology is relatively recent, and it's formed as a reaction to environmental crisis. And so, like the field of religion and ecology, or ecology and religion, it tends to be heavily present in academia, not so much elsewhere. But the thing is, eco-spirituality itself is ancient. It comes far before any of the world religions. It existed before there were cities anywhere in the world. It goes all the way back. It existed as long as there were human beings who were reverent. Clearly before the rise of science, before the rise of scholarship and all the rest of it. And the thing about this kind of nature spirituality, eco-spirituality, is you don't have to belong or be a member of any of the world religions to participate. You don't have to believe in a dogma or a book or a big story that supposedly encompasses everything. And you don't have to have extensive knowledge of ecology either. You don't have to be a scientist or an expert in religion or a philosopher. And so not much has been written about it, surprisingly, even though it's so old and has so many branches and is so diverse. But there hasn't been a lot written about it. And nevertheless, though, it's been practiced in indigenous and other societies for thousands of years. So we'll call it eco-spirituality as we go. And because it arises from the very conditions and existence of our life on Earth, we don't necessarily have to have grown up in an indigenous culture in order to practice eco-spiritual values. And we don't need to try to take them from one of those cultures either. We don't need to appropriate their rituals or their esoteric practices or any of that. Because we can use tools from within our own culture, tools from eco-psychology, ecotherapy, and now terrapsychology, in order to listen deeply to the places where we are, to the elements, to the language of nature, to the nature that's in our own bodies, and just be present for all that aliveness and speaking, and let all of these things teach us about reverent practices that would work for us. It's an endless conversation, or a whole series of conversations that goes on around us all the time, and all we need to do is listen and participate. So, eco-spirituality to some extent overlaps with the fields that I mentioned before, spiritual ecology, religion, and ecology, especially in its call to action during a time of planetary ecological danger. And like those fields, it also issues a call to revision the relationship between spirituality and ethics and ecology. But in eco-spiritual practices, the way I'm describing them here, these areas were never really split to begin with. And anthropocentrism, the idea that humans matter more than anybody else on the planet, was never dominant. It was just understood by most indigenous cultures as we understand their writings, their rituals, and the representatives of these cultures living today. As we understand what they have to say, the belief that human is more important than Earth makes no sense in those frameworks. It was just understood that all life needs respect, and that sacredness is a quality of the places where we live, and the sky, and the elements, and everything else. Everything, in other words, is ensouled and inspirited. So, like everything that's living, eco-spirituality has evolved down the millennia. So it includes both ancient and contemporary stories about participatory spirituality, ceremony, animism, pantheism, panentheism, monotheism, all of this, nature mysticism. And I think it's even wide enough to include recent scientific discoveries about the nature of reality. One of the criticisms that's often made by eco-oriented people to especially the more fundamental forms of world religions is that working with a cosmology that is as old as the Middle Ages or even older is simply, for a lot of us, not numinous anymore. We've moved beyond that, and it doesn't work for us anymore. Incidentally, this was something that Jung brought up also because it was so up for him in a personal way. Jung grew up in a household as the son of a clergyman who probably was losing his faith but not telling anybody about it. And so Jung, being brilliant and curious, had all kinds of questions, and he saw those religious books and philosophical books in his father's library, and he kept asking about the nature of reality and who is God and who is Jesus and all that. And his father's answers to a lot of that was like, just have faith, or just listen to what they say in church. And of course that didn't satisfy Jung. And so one of the things Jung was forced to realize pretty much throughout his entire life was that you're in a real dilemma when the old dogmas and traditions and learnings and cosmology simply don't have a charge for you anymore. That's just a psychological fact. And so then you have to go looking for what does have a charge for you. You have to go in search of what will actually speak to you spiritually. So there's a piece to this that I'd like to talk about next that has to do with something that I came across in my studies and my own seekings. I didn't grow up as a pastor's kid, but I had an experience similar to Jung's where a lot of what I was taught in a very conservative church that I grew up in simply fell away by the time I got to college. And yet there was a yearning in me always towards some kind of reverent spiritual practice. And so when I began listening to nature and place and earth, and I began to get interested in storytelling, that came alive for me. And so that began to piece together a spiritual path for me, and also a wisdom path as well. The two aren't separate in my way of thinking about it. So what I want to present now is an aspect of eco-spirituality that I think of as terra gnosis. And those terms are often thought of as contradictory. Gnosticism is usually thought of as a kind of otherworldly philosophy where all of creation is thought of as this grand mistake of some kind. And the goal is to just leave it all behind and to cultivate awareness of the inner divine and forget about the world. That's how Gnosticism is often thought of. I think that's quite wrong. There were Gnostics who thought that way, but we have a lot of Gnostic manuscripts to read now that have gradually surfaced in spite of the early churches' attempt to do away with them. And we find a much more complex picture in Gnosticism than that, and even aspects of it that look like they revere nature. So an earth-loving Gnostic sounds like a contradiction in terms, but actually might not be, especially in our time when we know more things in these different arenas than people of the past had available to them. So what I'd like you to imagine is that there is this kind of current of devotion, embodied practice. Nobody knows when it started. Probably back in ancient Africa, where we all come from. And it has never really been, in modern times anyway, in the spotlight or in the public, but it has continued to flow through human experience ever since then. And so for the people who are in this current, everything is ensouled and inspirited. Everything is in conversation with us. And we live in a holy world that is occupied by animate powers. And so the gods of this world, if we want to call them gods, we could call them daimons or other things, or archetypes. But the gods of this world are immanent, meaning they're present right in events and right in landscapes and right in the elements. They're not standing above or beyond them. And contemplative practices in this, we'll call it a tradition, kind of underground tradition, are linked with nature rituals that participate in the human and more than human conversation. And so this isn't really the same as esotericism as it's commonly understood. It's not really an attempt to strive upward into higher and higher realms the way esoteric thought sometimes does. The Hermetics in their publications go in that direction oftentimes. Theosophy does as well. So it's not really like neo-Gnosticism. And it's also not like a more intellectualized transcendentalism. And not so much New Age either. It's more like a chain that links all of us who are in this current to the presence of place, the soul of the world, and even the soul of the cosmos. And so there's a term that's been used. Jung kind of took it over from Goethe to describe esoteric interior knowledge and tradition, and it's referred to as the golden chain, which comes from alchemy too. And this way of understanding esotericism is kind of literalistic. So one version of it would be perennialism, where the idea is that all paths lead to the same path, and in the golden chain version of perennialism, there's this unbroken continuation from spiritual master to student who becomes a spiritual master, and then they teach other students. So it's a very literal image of how deep knowledge and wisdom get passed down generation after generation. What I'm referring to is something much less literal and much more underground. And it doesn't have to do with this person passes something on to that person. It's more about what surfaces in collective consciousness from time to time. And so instead of an Arya Catena, a golden chain that actually links people together, what I have in mind is more like a silver chain, something subtle, something more about unconscious knowledge of the world soul, and a set of practices around that. And so it takes different forms in different places where it comes to the surface. And so you can think of practitioner dreamers who surface here or there, sometimes in community, sometimes alone. I think about Nigeria and the founding of Ife, which is the home of the sacred stories of the Yoruba. And I think about India before 800 BC, where rishis were seers who were telling the tales that eventually became the Upanishads. Some were in Delphi who were prophesying as oracles for thousands of years. Even Plato and Aristotle would give reverence to the oracle at Delphi in their writings. Then the Palestinian Gnostics, of course, who were retelling the creation stories of Judaism to make them wisdom stories. A lot of them were centered on the presence of Sophia. So, and there's other places too. Alexandria, Baghdad, where the House of Wisdom sprang up. There's China and the Jixi Academy. The library at Alexandria. Alchemy starting out in Egypt, so alchemy is part of this tradition too. Especially the part of alchemy that studies the forces that seem to animate matter. Druids in Western Europe before the Romans came and killed them off. And so, in a way, these are what links these practitioners and dreamers together is that they all focus on some aspect of reverence toward the spirit of the world, the soul of the world, the anima mundi, and even the soul of the cosmos. Anima mundi, in that sense, means the animation of everything, with the anima terrae being a part of that, the soul of earth. So all of these silver chain practitioners, the Argentum Catena tradition, that doesn't exist as a literal handing down, but that does surface now and then throughout different cultures, probably all the major cultures on earth. They all have something to do with a deep connection between inner work and wisdom and outer reverence toward nature as experienced as ensouled. So that's the idea that I'm playing with in terms of how eco-spirituality has survived down the years. And so what I did was put together a timeline, a partial timeline of who these people might have been. And so I'd like to go through that with you so that we can get a sense of how does this look as it works its way down through history. So, of course, the silver chain, like all spiritual traditions, begins in ancient shamanism. And I think we can see bits and pieces of it in Paleolithic art, revering animals and plants and the elements and also stars. And There's been some recent research indicating that some cave art of animals actually looks like constellations and patterns in the sky. So it's not only an earth tradition severed from a sky tradition, but it's an earth tradition embodying a sky tradition. So remember, in these cultures, sky and earth aren't separated so much. They're all considered part of the weave of reality. So by 900 BCE, there's the first temple that goes up at Göbekli Tepe in eastern Turkey. By the way, the name Anatolia means sunrise, so that something was being born. And in that temple, there's a lot of not only nature imagery, but goddess imagery as well. And so then by 7500 BCE, Catalhoyuk begins to be the first city in the world, and it too has a lot of religious imagery. Oftentimes, towns and cities evolve from towns. They're often founded on places where nature practices first occurred, holy places. So 2600 BCE, the pyramids and the Sphinx are built, and the pyramid texts, which seem to be the oldest mythological texts in the world, record Egyptian embodied spiritual practices. And from here, of course, embalming gradually turns into alchemy, which is a wisdom tradition. And so oftentimes the silver chain coexists with certain forms of armed combat, aggression, imperialism, as though it were trying to compensate for it or respond to it, is maybe a better way of putting it. So 2334 BCE. So the Age of Empires starts when Sargon I begins conquering. And while he's doing that and forming the Akkadian Empire, his daughter Enheduanna starts composing the Exaltation of Inanna. And she is dialoguing with the goddess and interpreting her own dreams. 1400 BCE, the oracle at Delphi is founded. And the Pythoness, the oracle who prophesies there, does so until 930 CE, when the oracle is closed down by invaders. The Upanishads come along about 800 BCE, but they record far older traditions. Celtic craft and ritual is found in Austria. It goes back to 700 BCE. There's Thales of Miletus, born in 636 BCE. He comes along and says all things are full of gods, so he's part of the tradition. Pythagoras, the first in the Western tradition to write about Earth as mother. Asara of Lucania, around that time, the first depth psychologist. She has a book that she wrote called On Human Nature, the first such book in the world. It's now lost to us except for one page. I mentioned Eliyafe before, 500 BCE. Alexandrian Library, founded 331 BCE. Jixi Academy right afterwards. Gnosticism flourishes about the year 0 in the Western calendar. And there's some speculation that Jesus himself was a Gnostic, which gives an interesting perspective on all the nature metaphors that appear in his teachings. So to the year 200, this is just a sampler. The year 200, Maria Prophetessa of Alexandria, the first known alchemist. 390, Gnosticism is outlawed in the now Christian Roman Empire. And Gnostic manuscripts are literally buried in the ground to protect them from being incinerated. So they still are popping up. Every now and then there's a new dig that's discovered, and more of this treasure is unearthed. 415, Hypatia of Alexandria becomes a martyr. She is an astronomer, a Neoplatonic scholar and philosopher and scientist, director of the library at Alexandria. 762, the Abbasids found the House of Wisdom in Baghdad. The year 900 is when Muhammad ibn Umayl is born, the polymath, hermeticist, and alchemist, and he's the one that comes up with the phrase, turn the gold into silver. So he's one of the inspirations for the name Silver Chain. 1165, birth of Abu Muhammad ibn Arabi, who's the Sufi poet, mystic, and philosopher. And Henri Corbin will make a career out of writing about him and how his spiritual teachings shed light on the imaginal dimension of existence situated between the material and the spiritual. 1433, Marsilio Ficino and the Platonic Academy in Florence. 1493, Paracelsus the physician. 1548, Giordano Bruno, who's burned at the stake because he reveals his gnosis of a cosmos that's full of suns like ours. 1568, slaves are brought to the Caribbean by Spanish soldiers, and they're carrying with them Yoruba stories and practices that will continue to thrive and evolve. One direction they will take is in the pantheon of Orishas, who are not transcendent gods, but actually entities or beings who act like gods, but they're understood as being deeply involved and implicated in the material world as well. So Oshun is an example of that as the Orisha of fresh water. I'm not going to quote any more dates. I'm just going to mention some names of people I think are part of this silver chain. So Jacob Beamu, the mystic, Margaret Cavendish. I should mention too that a lot of mystics don't appear in this listing because many of them were almost totally preoccupied with realms far above. And that isn't part of the silver chain. We're talking about people who find spirituality as imminent in not only everyday life, but in the world of nature as well. Margaret Cavendish, I mentioned her before, Wolfgang Goethe, not only the composer of Faust, but the founder of Goethean phenomenology. William Blake, Gustav Fechner, Carl Jung, more earth-oriented in his life than in some of his writings, although bits and pieces appear in his writings too, as you can see in Meredith Sabini's collection, Earth Has a Soul. Hermann Hesse, although Hesse, he's a maybe member because of his dualism, and again, in his writings, he tends to separate spirit and matter, and he posits as a problem how to put the two of them back together. In his life, an avid gardener. So Christiana Morgan, whose visions Jung made so much of in the Visions seminars. Henri Corbin, I mentioned him, the Sufi scholar. Jane Hollister Wheelwright, who is trained by Jung, one of the original circle of Jungian analysts, and probably the first real eco-psychologist. She referred to Earth as the divinity that's not recognized. The Harlem Renaissance of 1924, the syncretic and liberatory spiritualism of it in particular. 1944, birth of Alice Walker, who writes and lives within an animate world, as you can see from her essays. So we can give other examples too, but I think I'm laboring the point. I think you get the idea. So I refer to this silver path as terra gnosis, which offers an eco-spirituality without authorities, books, bishops, and so on. And terra not only meaning earth, but here, place, embodiment, and gnosis for eco-spiritual knowledge that is available from communing with the intelligence of an animate cosmos. So for us, the world is our temple. The sacred lives in us, but also outside of us and all around us. This is a tradition that's truly ancient, and symbols are a primary way that the earth and the cosmos speak to us in this way of practicing reverence. So I want to look into what a daily practice might look like in terms of terranostic reverence, but also the pursuit of wisdom. And so this looks like a continuing conversation with oneself, one's moods, responses, thoughts, one's full senses, A conversation that's ongoing with the unconscious in the different ways that depth psychology has told us to listen through dreams, free associations, paying attention to our fantasies, body states, using active imagination. A conversation with each other, because depth is not only within, but it's also between. So speaking and listening from the heart, watching for our projections, using imagination to empathize and respond deeply to each other. Being in conversation with animals and plants and the non-human beings who share our world, and also being in conversation with the world itself. The lands and waters, the elements and skies, the wind, and even matter, the supposedly inanimate objects that we share our lives with. There's a small book I wrote on this called In the Thick of Things that gives examples of how the behavior of objects sometimes has very interesting things to say about how we're living our lives. It's as though the objects comment on it. The objects object to being treated as objects sometimes. They deserve a certain amount of respect. And so there's one other piece I want to talk about briefly, which is has to do with reimagining what we think of as the gods. And so previously, in another presentation, I mentioned a part of the Red Book of Jung. And the Red Book was something that he constructed after writing in the journals of the Black Books. And so he put together the Red Book with paintings and some beautiful calligraphy. And it's an account of his visionary journeys from 1913 to 1916. And he went on working on it for another few decades. And there's a part in it that I think is particularly important where Jung is confronted by a giant that he refers to as Izdubar, which is also the name of Gilgamesh. And so he realizes at some point that Izdubar is an imaginal structure. This being who's been worshipped as a god is actually a chunk of fantasy. Not fantasy in the sense of we just made it up, but more like an archetype, although Jung doesn't use the word archetype in the Red Book. It's a later coinage, but the idea is clearly present. Gilgamesh, Izdubar, is an archetypal figure. And so in his imagination, Jung, when Izdubar complains that he's sick, which is what happens to the gods, they grow old. They no longer fit the spirit of the time. Consciousness moves beyond them somehow. And so they begin to lose their vitality. And so Jung carries them around for a while, and then he performs some incantations, and he brings them back to life in altered form. And so there's this picture that we've seen for a while that a lot of us didn't quite understand because we didn't have the context of the Red Book, which wasn't published until fairly recently. But there's a picture of somebody bending down toward an object on the ground, and it's spewing an enormous blaze, this outpouring of fire. And this records the part of Jung's visionary experience in which, because of his realizations about what he'll later call archetypes, an enormous amount of psychic energy is released, and this figure is reborn as a psychical structure, as illumination, solar illumination. And so this actually has a historical context. So every now and then, when the stories begin to circulate about the gods dying out, the great god Pan is dead, that kind of thing. A tree dedicated to Thor falls down somewhere in Germany. The gods wear out. People stop thinking of Zeus and Hera as worthy of worship. And then they become fictions, or some people cling to them as ideologies, and they get a little more life out of them that way. But when they're reinterpreted in terms of a contemporary understanding of what they represent, then they come back to life. So in a way, Jung brings Gilgamesh back to life as a psychical being, as an archetype. So by doing this, Jung participates in what he thinks of in his writing as the evolution of the God image. So, the question asked from a Terra-Gnostic standpoint is, do what we understand as the deities and now as archetypes want to be revisioned again? Are we to the point where we need to actually reinterpret them? And so, in ancient times, the gods were thought of as forces or presences, holy presences that were behind nature. And then they were reimagined in what Joseph Campbell calls planting societies as celestial kings and queens. The Gnostics reimagined them again as powers that we could actually talk to inside ourselves. And Jung, who was influenced by the Gnostics, carried this even further and started thinking of them as first as psychological archetypes and then as more, what's the right word? Archetypes that exist inside as well as outside of us, more foundational archetypes. So I'm wondering if we've now come to a higher turn in the spiral and that there's something to be gained by thinking about these deities once again as natural forces that are sentient, with the sensibility of an animism 2.0. So with what parapsychology and pan-experientialism and a number of other endeavors, eco-psychology, depth psychology, have now given us, can we think of these sacred beings, spirits, whatever we want to call them, archetypes, as aspects of the natural world, but at a different level from how they were previously understood? It seems to me that with the learnings accumulated over the millennia, with all these different reimaginings, we are now able to reconnect with these sacred presences outside and inside simultaneously. They're not just exterior forces abroad in the world. They're not just internally perceived archetypes. They're both, and they're also something more. So in this way, we re-enchant the world by how we perceive it as being animated by these presences. So what this would mean is that all the deities that manifest as nature deities, all the deities that manifest as religious deities, represent some aspect of the natural world. Now, they could be more than that. And it's inherent in how Jung understood archetypes that there's a dimension to them that really is transcendent. The word that he used to refer to that was the psychoid, meaning beyond the physical, beyond the psychological, something unknowable at the back of everything. A kind of, in a letter he described it as a kind of world of potential that exists beyond everything that we know. So perhaps they have that dimension too. But the way they show up for us is immanent. And so we could think of Zeus and his fellow sky gods not just as behind the heights or personifying the heights. They are height. They are sky, but understood in an animated way. There's no wind god, because wind is a godlike presence, blowing where it listeth. Spirit and wind correlate in many different languages. A cyclone's eye gazes down on what it rolls over, right? So, Trickster, another example. He's the fly in the cosmic ointment. He's the aspect of reality that always is kind of at odds with itself. Underworld, in the ground, as well as other ways that we understand it. Eros in every connection. Subatomic, molecular, planetary, extragalactic. All of these embodied, all of these speaking to us all the time. And we see this in myth as well. So this is why I would say that there's a close connection between myth and nature, as we'll find out in another presentation. R.S. Coppin, the scholar, talks about how, in a sense, the vines and the growth are Demeter. The sea is Poseidon. Athena and Apollo are wisdom and truth. And so Robert Strange puts it this way: the gods do not represent or symbolize the elements of the world. They are our world. So, something to think about. And I'm going to end with a poem, a piece of a poem by Rilke. And this is from Ah, Not to Be Cut Off. Ah, not to be cut off. Not through the slightest partition, shut out from the law of the stars. The inner, what is it, if not intensified sky? Hurled through hurled through with birds and deep, with the winds of homecoming. Thank you.